Hi, everybody. Welcome into another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me on the show, and I am not being hyperbolic, one of America's best sports reporters, Sam McDowell, a columnist for the Kansas City Star. I mean that, Sam. I follow your work closely, and you just do a tremendous job. I really look up to the way that you write, and I am excited to talk to you about the Kansas City Chiefs. What is going on, man?
Yeah, I appreciate that. If you could follow me around and give me that intro every day, that'd be great.
Well, I only read the Chiefs stuff. I don't know what you write about the Kansas City Royals, though. That's got to be a pretty rough ride. I saw the other day, I don't mean to get off on a tangent here, as the Twins are in the playoffs winning playoff games. Um, they won like 50 games and brought their manager back. And so I like, oh, okay. I guess that's kind of what you're dealing with there. It's like the exact polar opposites of the world's greatest football team and the world's worst baseball team. That's got to be weird.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday so Tuesday morning there was a postseason press conference, and I was just kind of thinking about the irony of the fact that postseason baseball for the Royals means literally after the season is over, we're having a press conference talking about the season. It's not postseason baseball. Eight straight years now of losing seasons, and they tied the franchise record for the worst season ever. So yeah, it's a little bit different than covering the team that just won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, our guy Alec Lewis came from there covering, the Royals for the Athletic, and then he moved here.
It is,
Eventually,
but
he'll cover a team that wins. So he's going from like the worst franchise to a franchise that's stuck in the middle, and then next, maybe he'll return to cover the Chiefs or something for the Athletic. I want to ask you this, and I want to get into all this, with the way Kansas City is played and how somehow they made Zach Wilson look decent the other day. What's it like to cover a Super Bowl? Tell us a tale, because I haven't. I'm from Buffalo and then moved to Minnesota. There's no championships in my background. What is that like when a team that went through what Minnesota has dealt with forever, just always like second best, always just good to get into playoffs, but never enough. And when they finally got over the hump to greatness, what was that like?
yeah, I mean, from purely from a media perspective, it is the absolute busiest week of the year, but just enjoyable as heck. And there's very little sleep, but you're working on all stuff that feels like a big deal because the game is such a big deal. And look, Kansas City was a football town before this team started winning Super Bowls, but we've reached a place where readers want to consume everything there is to consume about this team. And so, I mean, journalistically, you don't root for the local teams, but it certainly helps business when the local teams are interesting. And the quarterback is obviously the most interesting, but the fans here care about who's going to be the 53rd guy on the roster. And so that's what the Super Bowl, I think, has really elevated in terms of like media perspective of coverage. But you from the get go at the Super Bowl are introduced to just how big of a freaking deal it is, and that's on media night when, I mean, there's tons and tons of you there, and it's like, well, we're not in this. Arrowhead Stadium's practice facility has one of the smallest media rooms in the league, and there's only about 40 of us that can cram in there on any given day, and to go into Miami Marlins Park or where the Phoenix Suns play in downtown Phoenix, you're pretty quickly introduced to, all right, yeah, we're not in the same place that we've been covering this team all year, and there's a lot more eyeballs on this team than you probably have any sort of grasp on because you're so in the moment throughout the season.
I was lucky enough to cover a Super Bowl night when the Super Bowl was in Minnesota, and you're walking around and like the guy who's on Curb Your Enthusiasm walks by, and you're like, "Wait, what? What? Oh,
Yeah,
how did these people get in
yeah,
here?" And it's absolute madness. So you have like these scrums around players where it's a bunch of people, and one person is asking, and this did happen, Jason McCourty or Devin McCourty. Well, I'm not sure which one, but they're asking him like to rate Tom Brady's attractiveness on a 1 to 10 scale. And then the next person is asking about like cover one robber. And you're just like, what is
right.
going on here? It's very crazy. But I guess, I mean, even from a city perspective of just, part of the identity of Vikings fans, and I really see these two teams as the AFC NFC reflection of each other until just recently. It's part of their identity that they have not won. And I know Kansas City way back in the day, of course, against the Vikings, but it's just such a long time of getting close and losing at the worst possible moment, having great teams and just not being able to get over that hump. It has to be weird because people are like constantly in a state of being upset here about the team because of that. And whenever anything goes wrong, they're like, "Ah, oh, this is us again." And what's it like when that goes away? I feel like that's got to be the strange part.
Yeah, I actually still don't. I mean, it was such a long streak that I'm not sure it has completely gone away. I mean, the Chiefs went 20 some years without a playoff win, and even more at home because when they broke that streak, it was in Houston, and they lost 8 straight home playoff games in just the weirdest way possible. And you saw a fan base that had started to brace itself for the worst imaginable to happen. And I still trace back to the year that they won the Super Bowl for the first time with Patrick Mahomes. And they were down 24 to nothing to Houston. And that was the game that you were like, man, I thought this guy was beyond that. And I guess he's just going to fit into the narrative that's been Kansas City Chiefs playoff history for the past 3 decades. And then single-handedly, he willed them back and scored 50-some points. And I mean, heck, the Chiefs won that game by 3 possessions. And to me, that was the turning point for the organization to where, all right, this guy really is different than anything else they've had before. And I realized we should have had plenty of evidence before that. But at some point in the psyche of Chiefs fans, I think that the history of what they had been through had to take over until they were proven otherwise.
So I remember where I was for that game. I was in the San Jose airport returning home after the Vikings had just lost to San Francisco. And I
Right.
was thinking about how it just all of a sudden they're different, Kansas City and Minnesota, because when the Vikings got down to the 49ers, it was over and none of us thought they were coming back at that point. And when Kansas City gets down 24, it's not over and it's never over as long as you have Mahomes. Now, your perspective on Mahomes, is really interesting because from the outside world, he's just invincible. But also at the same time, I feel like as a if you're covering someone every day, you see all the different parts of who they are. And it's hard not to think that though with him. I mean, they break his ankle and he still finds a way to run for a first down in the Super Bowl. They get him down 24. There is a will to this player to win the football game no matter what happens, including against the Jets the other night where he's playing like the worst game of his life and yet
Yeah.
still finds a way when it's third and whatever to run for a first down, to make some sort of play. There's very few guys. I mean, it's really like it's Favre without Favre's baggage and idiotic interceptions or something. I have no idea how to contextualize it. I don't know if I've ever seen anything quite like it. Folks, we are going all in on prize picks this football season. Every week, we are playing and testing out our skills here on Purple Insider to see if we can predict what numbers players will put up every Sunday. If you haven't heard of it, trust me, you're going to want to check it out. Prize picks is the easiest and best way to play daily fantasy. Instead of battling against thousands of other players and people who spend their entire lives doing fantasy, all you do is pick more or less on between 2 and 6 player stat projections. So, say a quarterback's number is 250.5 yards, go more or less, and bang, you are playing. And you can pick from hundreds of players and numbers this football season. The cool thing is that it's quick and easy and does not cost an arm and a leg. You can turn $10 into 250 just like that. Again, the perfect way to fit it into a busy day. Click, click, and you're playing. This isn't just something that I like. You're going to hear us doing every single week prize picks on the show on Purple Insider. So go to prizepicks.com/purple and use the code PURPLE for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/purple with the code PURPLE. Daily fantasy sports made easy.
Yeah, it's interesting timing that we're having this conversation because I'm back home after a Patrick Mahomes press conference, and I asked him about his 2 interceptions in New York. And for the longest time with Patrick Mahomes, we asked him about all the crazy stuff he did that went well. That has become so routine that now when he has a game like he had Sunday in New York, that's the anomaly. And so that's what I'm like most interested in is, I talked to the third string quarterback today for 10 minutes about what Patrick Mahomes was like in the film room. Because I was like, he doesn't have that many of these games. How does he respond when he does have these games? And post game in New York, I had conversations with about 10 people that said, what was he like on the sidelines? What was he like at halftime? And I do think that peek behind the curtain, which is those guys said that Donovan Smith, the left tackle, told me at one point he basically went up and down the sideline after his first interception and wanted to make sure everybody knew it was his fault. Because, frankly, this offense hasn't played as well as we've seen in the past. I think he wants everyone to think like, hey, I've got to play better too. And that was his message today. But it just shows just the difference in where the bar is now compared to where the bar was before he got here, is that he's done it so consistently. And that's probably the one thing that's not talked about enough, because I think his peak is talked about plenty. But it's the fact that he's able to get to his peak as regularly and as frequently as he does that sort of gets lost in that shuffle, to where when we don't see his peak, it's just like, well, what's going on with him? There were conversations on Sunday night about, is his arm okay? And it's like, well, the guy is allowed to have an off day. Literally everybody else in football does it. In fact, end on this point, but one of the other offensive linemen, Nicholas Allegretti, told me when Mahomes was taking blame for this at halftime, he's like, we've got 10 other guys on offense. They screw up a lot. It's okay if you screw up every once in a while too.
Which I want to get to, because they're screwing up more often than we've seen the supporting cast for Patrick Mahomes screw up. But just to stay with this point, one time I charted ESPN's QBR and PFF grades for Mahomes versus like Kirk Cousins, a number of other quarterbacks. And I was trying to come up with sort of a baseball-y quality start. Like if you score over a 60 with QBR and over an 80 with PFF, like how often does that happen? And with Kirk, it's like 10 times a year, which is really good. That's a quality player. With Mahomes out of 17 games, it's like 14. It is just remarkable how night in and night out. And that's kind of like with basketball. The greatest players, almost anybody in the NBA can score 30 points in a game, but to do it time and time and time again without losing the efficiency is just mind-blowing. And the other thing about him that's been shocking since day one is just his personality. Like there's that video from the first Super Bowl on the sideline of him basically calling his own play, where he throws the ball to Tyreek Hill. I just feel like he's the perfect intersection of everything that you want from a character of a quarterback with also the physical talent that has overcome any of the other things that might be shortcomings, like an erratic play style in college, footwork that everybody wanted to talk about in the draft spear and everything else, that his character has kind of pushed him forward to where he is now, because it's remarkable how he's handled also the absurd amount of fame that goes along with being a multi Super Bowl winner.
I actually think, Matt, that you just hit on what scouts whiffed on ahead of the draft. Yes, this guy was taken 10th overall. And, revisionist history has, well, Sean Payton was going to take him at 11, or the Cardinals were going to take him afterwards. I do wonder where he would have gone had the Chiefs not taken him. Obviously, the Chiefs had some intel that they needed to move up to 10. But 10 for a guy of that stature, you think, why didn't this guy go number one, at least in the top 5? And I think it's what you just hit on. They whiffed on the personality part. It's not like they thought this guy had a troubling personality. It's that they didn't understand the competitive desire. And I actually used this in a column last week as an example. So he was asked about the Jets cornerbacks going into the week, which, because DJ Reed and Sauce Gardner are probably as good of a cornerback duo in the league as there is. And he, first thing out of his mouth was, he goes, well, DJ Reed got a pick 6 on me in college. And so I was like, it's 7 years ago now, 6 years ago now. No, it was his junior year. So it was 7 years ago now. And I said, so I didn't ask that original question, but it, of course, piqued my interest. And I said, what do you remember about that play? It was every detail of that play that he remembered. And he's always had this sort of memory to where he can recall very specific things that he sees in a play, but it's amazing how much better he recalls it when it's something that didn't go well. And you talk to people from his childhood, and when things didn't go, his last ever NFL or high school football game, On the bus ride home, he's texting the basketball coach because their season has already started and said, "Hey, we play a game tomorrow. Can I get in the lineup tomorrow?" He is just so driven by the things that go wrong. And I understand that a draft process is a lot of looking at film. It is talking to the people that know him. But when you tap into that part of him, you see that he's pretty frequently motivated by failure more than he is the success. And I think that's a major part of why he's become who he has become at the NFL level.
Guys, I know you might act tough and pretend that you don't care about how the skin on your face looks, but we all want to show up to those football parties and holiday get togethers looking good. That's where Caldera Lab comes in. Over 100,000 men trust Caldera Lab because of the way that an easy skincare routine turns into clearer skin. They get results. And hey, it makes a great gift as well. You're going to want to try out the regimen, which has 3 simple parts: the clean slate, which is a face wash that leaves you feeling refreshed, the base layer that moisturizes and hydrates your skin, and the good. This helps your skin look tighter and smoother, and dare I say, even a little bit younger with the reduction of wrinkles and fine lines. If you've looked in the mirror and thought, when did I start looking like this? Well, the trials have shown that 94% of men showed improvement in their appearance using Caldera Lab for just a few weeks. So, just for you guys, use the code INSIDER at calderalab.com and get 20% off right now. That is 20% off at calderalab.com with the code INSIDER to make an unforgettable first impression and give the best gift this holiday season. Folks, want to remind you to make Little Caesars the official pizza sponsor of the NFL part of your game day. Order online during their Pizza pregame 1 hour before NFL games and get ready for some football and fun. Choose your favorite Little Caesars pizza or pick the toppings you crave. Either way, you win. And speaking of winning, everyone scores with convenient delivery or their in-store pizza portal pickup. So grab some friends and enjoy a few slices during the tastiest hour before kickoff. Yeah, and I don't understand how photographic memory works. Like, people use that term, and I don't know if that's like a real thing or if it's just, but Kirk Cousins is the same exact way. I don't know if it's a difference between negative or positive, but his recall on plays, even after they just happened or 15 years ago, is astounding. And I remember reading this like in Bruce Arians' book about Peyton Manning, where he could just recall everything so well. And I think that's a hugely underrated part. I was amazed because now we know the answer. So you got to go back and look for what was it that caused this. When he did the Gruden camp sit down, most of those guys, even your Andrew Lucks, even like your top picks, were pretty intimidated by John Gruden. And he sort of diffused Gruden with his personality pretty calmly, and they had like a normal discussion, which is weird with John Gruden. And I just thought, like, there's a relatability about this guy. And then, people watch the Netflix documentary. You and I both know how that's put together, and it's, to make both all the guys look good. Mariota couldn't make himself look good in that, no matter what. But I think there's something there to that as well. That when you're talking about being a leader, that even if you're a part owner in another, sports team in town, that you have so much money and so much fame, but yet to be the guy in the locker room, that it doesn't seem like it's that way. There just seems to be part of that as his personality.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, it stands out, I think, to your teammates when you're the guy that raises your hand first. Patrick Mahomes actually said after the last week's game that nobody was pointing fingers, except for all of his teammates said he came in the locker room and said, I'm going to stop BSing in this game. And it's like, well, he was pointing fingers basically at himself. But I think what it leads to is you don't make the same mistake twice very often. Before his first season as a full-time NFL starter, they played preseason game against the Falcons, and they were leading by the time he got pulled. He played almost half the game. Maybe he did play the entire first half, but the Chiefs' offense didn't play very well. Nobody remembers that part. They remember a play where Patrick Mahomes threw the ball 59 yards in the air. It was longer than anyone had completed a pass as far as the air yards, any pass during the previous season. And so I asked him this preseason because he had made another play as a rookie, even though it was Alex Smith still starting that year, that a lot of people remember too. And I said, which one is your favorite, most memorable play from the preseason? And he said, actually, it was an interception I threw in that Falcons game. And I said, why that play? And he said, well, because it was just a go route basically to Sammy Watkins. And he was told if Sammy Watkins cuts in, he was on his right side. If Sammy Watkins cuts inside the cornerback, don't throw it to him because the safety is going to come down and pick that off. He's got to get outside the cornerback. Gets inside the cornerback, he still throws it, gets intercepted. So that play happens in the Super Bowl that same year and a half later. So we're talking 16 months later. Same Andy Reid has called that play for the first time in 16 months. Sammy Watkins again cuts inside the cornerback, and Mahomes is flashing back to this. Well, last time when he did this, I threw an interception. He throws it over his right shoulder, and that is the play where he beats Richard Sherman down the sideline late in the fourth quarter that sets up their go-ahead touchdown. And so it's not just like a cool anecdote that these guys remember this sort of thing. You mentioned Cousins as well. Like they apply this stuff in games, and he applied it at the biggest to that point in the biggest moment of his life to help him win again at that point the biggest game of his life.
See, this is where I am journalistically jealous because these things become lore, right? Like
Right.
they
Yeah.
happen in games and the intellect of these players or however you want to talk about it is so high to play in the NFL for a lot of players. And so when they win, they want to tell you about it, and when they don't want to talk too much about it. So, but that's super interesting, and I think it really is this intersection of so many different skills to create in a lab this quarterback. However, as we get into this game, Vikings and Chiefs, US Bank Stadium, it's not just that Mahomes has looked a little bit human this year. It's that the Chiefs have. And that's not to say they're not good because they're definitely good. And when you can win a game where the other team has played better for a lot of the game and still find a way to win, it probably means that you're good. But when I look at their receivers, it's just this is different even from having Juju Smith-Schuster. This is like I'm not sure they have anything here, and I don't know how much a quarterback can do to elevate them to a great offense. I think you could be good without good wide receivers, but I don't know if you could be great. And to me, unless some of these guys develop, and we just haven't seen a whole lot from someone like Sky Moore, we saw all the drops against the Lions and so forth. I don't know that they're as scary as they would have been even just last year.
Yeah, so there's some complications going on. First of all, I mean, the Chiefs are still third in the NFL in yards. And again, like almost all of today's press conference with both Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes was about offensive struggles. And heck, that's the gist of the questions that I asked too. The wide receivers, I was one of the guys that said, I don't think the wide receivers are going to be a problem. You mentioned Juju Smith-Schuster. He averaged 40 yards per game in his last 11 games in Kansas City. They lost Mecole Hardman. The Chiefs were 11-1 without Mecole Hardman last year. Those were the two guys they lost. And they did spend a second-round pick on Rashee Rice. Kadarius Toney, you thought, could get better in year two. The problem is what you mentioned is with a guy like Sky Moore, now it's been a year and a half that he's been with the Chiefs. And so the next steps have to happen at some point. Travis Kelce is also turning 34 this month. And so he's their number one wide receiver. He lines up off the line of scrimmage on 60% of his snaps, at least outside the tackles. And so I think at some point, yeah, I mean, Travis Kelce is going to cease to be the best tight end in the league, and therefore you're going to rely on these other guys to catch up. And that's what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to catch up. And what teams are doing against them, I'm interested to see if Minnesota does this because Brian Flores does not typically do this, but they've been running tons of zone against them. Because what the Chiefs do against zone is they basically give their wide receivers options. They don't just say, go run to this spot. They say, stop here if it's a zone. Keep progressing on this. Because they like to run what they call good versus all plays. It's only good versus all if the wide receiver recognizes what it is. And what teams are basically banking on is that the Chiefs' inexperience will prevent the quarterback and wide receiver from being on the same page. And to me, it's disappointing that Sky Moore hasn't yet gotten to that next level because now he's had adequate time. I do think Rashee Rice is the problem solver eventually, but I think that allows the Chiefs to have some reason to believe that Week 18 will look different than week 4 because they are operating with a really young group. And I don't think their problem is talent. I do think it is being on the same page with the quarterback. And you can't cheat time on that. It's going to actually take the time. And look, I mean, Travis Kelce said it took him a year and a half to be able to run his own stuff with Patrick Mahomes. And if it took that guy a year and a half to be able to know what Patrick Mahomes was seeing on a play, it's going to take some of these other receivers, that and then some.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see how Brian Flores approaches this, because I think that everybody knows that if you blitz Patrick Mahomes, if you don't
Yeah.
get home, which most of the time you don't, like then it's just all sorts of problems, and you have one-on-one coverage everywhere, and he can make plays out of structure. What the Vikings have been doing, interestingly, is kind of blitzing, but also playing a lot of two deep safeties and trying to keep things in front of them, which is why opposing teams in the last 3 games have an 80% completion percentage. But also, it's been a lot of short stuff, and Justin Herbert has, really, really did that to them. But even Bryce Young had some completions on quick and short passes that had some success against this defense while the Vikings were playing so aggressively. Also, I'm not so sure that you have to play aggressively in a blitzing style when Jawan Taylor plays for the other team. I'm getting word that he has been flagged 8 times since we've been talking. So that's going to be tough. I've never seen a player get penalized this much, and the Vikings had a guard a few years ago who couldn't stop like jumping offside or false starting, but that seems to be the center of the issue here. And with the Vikings getting Marcus Davenport back to pair with Danielle Hunter, I think if there's one advantage the Vikings have on defense, and it's the only one, it's that their edge rushers are a lot better than Kansas City's tackles. How does Kansas City solve this problem?
Well, I do think it's the quick stuff. And you actually saw that last week in New York was, first of all, Patrick Mahomes from our buddy at Sumer Sports, like they put out data on his scramble percentage, and he is almost doubling his career norms in the amount of times he's scrambling. But it's actually twofold. I think most people would look at that and say, well, the offensive line's really struggling. It's a combination of he's not finding guys open downfield, so he's taking off with his legs. So what the Chiefs did in New York is the second to last drive after they'd had a few not go their way, they threw a bunch of short stuff. Patrick Mahomes completed 7 straight passes, and I didn't check the air yards on the pass, but the longest completion was like 10 yards. And so they just eventually said, let's just get it in the wide receiver's hands. And I mentioned Rashee Rice, like that's where he's really good, is once he catches the ball, if he does catch it, he's had a problem with drops. He did in college. He's had a problem with drops early in his NFL career, but he's really good after the catch because he's sort of this bowling ball. I seek out contact kind of receiver. So to me, I think it sets up well for the Chiefs if the lessons they learned from last week are something they're ready to apply this week. And look, for 3 years now, teams have been begging Patrick Mahomes not to go deep. And if another team, if you say that they're also playing, I knew they were doing a lot of blitzing because I checked those numbers. But I didn't know that they were still playing too high so frequently while they were blitzing. That'd be a really good combination for the adjustments the Chiefs have made, but it's a mental thing for them. They don't always like to apply those adjustments. I mean, I think both of Patrick Mahomes' interceptions last week were just plain, I'm bored with not being able to throw the ball where I want to throw it.
Yeah, and last week it was a little different from the too high stuff. That was a lot against Herbert. Last week against Bryce Young, they brought Harrison Smith to the line of scrimmage on like 70% of plays because they had no belief that Bryce Young could beat them deep. Obviously, they're going to feel differently about Patrick Mahomes. So I'm expecting that they play a little bit more like they did against Herbert. And the reality of that game was when I went back and watched it, was just Justin Herbert played incredible football, which we know that Patrick Mahomes is capable of. But his Keenan Allen is Travis Kelce in this case. And how do opposing teams on a week-to-week basis, when you watch them, try to take away Kelce, and why are they never truly able to do it?
I'm stunned that there's not more double teams. He does get chipped a lot at the line, of course, but I'm just stunned that they don't stick with more double teams. There was a game in Patrick Mahomes' rookie year in the AFC Championship game when the Patriots beat him, and Bill Belichick shut him out for the first half. Now, the Chiefs scored 31 in the second half, but in that first half, they just said, well, Travis Kelce's not beating us. You're going to have to make somebody else beat us. And like I said, the Chiefs had to have a regroup at halftime before they finally solved it. I'm stunned that there aren't more teams that are doing that. I will say, looking up the numbers as far as how teams do against wide receiver ones, wide receiver twos, threes, and then tight ends, like the Vikings defend tight ends, it seems like pretty well, at least in the first opening month. And on the flip side, I'm sure we'll get to that, but Matt, the Chiefs have defended ones, twos, and threes really well. They have not defended the tight end well at all. And so that's I think both tight end matchups are interesting for that reason, because if the Vikings are able to take away at least a little bit of the Chiefs tight end, where do they go? And then how much can the Chiefs do to slow down? I think the best tight end that they've faced so far this year.
Yeah, and I think from the Vikings' perspective, that's probably personnel based because the only good tight end they went up against was Dallas Goedert, and the Eagles ran for 260 yards that day, so they really didn't need to throw to the tight end very often. But it's kind of been the case that outside of Carolina, whatever works for the opposing offense, they're able to do against the Vikings defense, and so this has certainly shootout potential if the Vikings can perform offensively, and it's been very rocky for them. Even though Kirk Cousins numbers are extremely good, there's been this quarter, this half where it's up, where it's down, which has kind of been a staple of him, but maybe more to the extreme. Yet, whenever they need it, they have the universe's greatest wide receiver. And as you mentioned, TJ Hawkinson has not gotten off to a great start, but is a tremendous weapon for them. And surprisingly, the offensive line outside of one guard position has been a major plus, which means more opportunities for Kirk Cousins in clean pockets. So the matchup to me where this all can change is Chris Jones versus the Vikings interior offensive line. This is the biggest mismatch in my mind on the entire field. Is Chris Jones back to being like freaky scary Chris Jones after missing the first couple of weeks here? Or of training camp, I mean, those weeks of training camp?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris Jones made the argument for why none of us need to travel an hour and a half north to St. Joseph every preseason to cover training camp. I was stunned at how good he was in Jacksonville his first game. Now he played less against the Bears. They got it off to a big lead. I think they saw it as an opportunity to rest him. He did have a sack against the Jets on a Hail Mary play. I thought he was still less effective in that game, and the Jets' offensive line is one he also should probably take advantage of. But Chris Jones is like the entirety of the Chiefs' defensive line production. Even their other guys that get some sacks. George Karlaftis is a second-year guy. Mike Dana, end of his rookie year deal this year. But they're guys that feed off of Chris Jones getting double teamed out every play. So even when Chris isn't effective, he still is allowing everyone else to play one-on-one. And Steve Spagnuolo loves to blitz, and he loves to do it in a different way. Cornerbacks blitz a lot for the Chiefs off the edge. Trent McDuffie, L'Jarius Sneed. So I think you'll see quite a bit of that this weekend. But you mentioned that wide receiver. I mean, I think every team in the NFL that faces Justin Jefferson is going to be saying, hey, we're playing the best wide receiver we've played this year. But it really stands out with the groups that the Chiefs have played. Like, this is far and away the best guy that the Chiefs – best combination, I should say, that the Chiefs will face, because they did face Garrett Wilson a week ago with Zach Wilson thrown to him, right? So you've got a capable quarterback and that talent at wide receiver. The Chiefs have left their cornerbacks on an island a lot this year. And I don't think that's a guy you can, have L'Jarius Sneed just guard one-on-one so frequently.
Astounding. I've seen teams try to do everything and anything against Justin Jefferson, and nothing works. Nothing. I mean, the only time that a team slowed him down really effectively was when the turf at Lambeau Field was really slippery and Jair Alexander could get him at the line of scrimmage because he didn't have the right cleats on. Like, that's what it takes for Justin Jefferson to not have dominant days, which I think is also speaks to Kevin O'Connell's ability to draw up opportunities for him. But the thing that's going on with the Vikings, at least that as of this moment, and this could change this weekend, is that it's still the Justin Jefferson offense. And it's not Justin Jefferson and friends like they kind of drew it up. The running game improved for the Vikings the last 2 weeks. We'll see how that goes. Those are spotty from week to week. But it has really not been a complete effort, which I think if there's an opportunity for Kansas City to take advantage, it's can you survive the big punches from Justin Jefferson and force somebody else to be the answer for the Vikings?
Patrick Mahomes actually had a really good compliment about Justin Jefferson today. He said that he's deceptively physical because of the way he catches the ball. He'll put his body anywhere to try and be to stave off a defender or just put himself in the best position to make a catch. And said just a lot of guys don't want to have that kind of contact at the point of the catch. But with the Chiefs, teams have gotten them in the past few years with the run, and we haven't seen that as much this year. And so I think, if the Vikings do struggle to run the ball, that's why the Chiefs defense has been really good for the first opening month of the season, is they've sort of solved their Achilles heel. But one of the reasons they've done that is Trent McDuffie, his second-year cornerback, is playing at a Pro Bowl level through the first month. He's actually Pro Football Focus's highest-rated cornerback through the opening month. L'Jarius Sneed's always been a very adequate – he's either a really good number 2 or, a borderline number 1 cornerback. And so their cornerbacks are winning, and they're getting more numbers in the run game because of it. I do think Nick Bolton will come back this week in Minnesota to play. And Minnesota's missed the past couple of weeks. They're, the second leading tackler in the NFL last year. But I wonder if the Chiefs, Steve Spagnuolo usually has too much pride than to send extra bodies at a star wide receiver. He infamously got beat by Jamar Chase 2 times in 3 weeks because he left him single covered a lot. And I just don't think this is a guy you can let do that, especially with what you mentioned, that they've struggled to get other parts of their offense going. But it's just not really his style to double team a number 1 wideout. So I think that's probably the most intriguing part of that Vikings offense, Chiefs defense matchup.
I could tell you that they're going to need 2. It can't take 1. I mean, truly, I wrote a piece a couple of, I guess it was last week, about Jefferson's fearlessness, that there is nowhere you can put the football where he won't go up and get it. Like we talk about over the middle and how when we were growing up, you could just murder the wide receiver, but it's still scary to go full speed at 20 miles an hour over the middle, knowing you could get popped. He does not care. And Kirk was talking today about how he can throw it into spaces knowing that Jefferson has body control. And if you look at what he did on his touchdown last week, that he can alter his body and he will go to places that other people can't to catch the football. The one guy cannot handle that. It doesn't really matter who it's been. I haven't seen anyone outside of that game of Jair Alexander shut him down. There was a weird Jeff Okudah game against the Vikings in week 2 last year, but I think they committed like 8 penalties in order to do that. So maybe that's part of the strategy. As far as this game goes and the meaning to the Kansas City Chiefs, another week, not that way for the Vikings though. For the Vikings at 1-3, 2 of the next 3 weeks, they're playing Kansas City and San Francisco. They need to upset one of those teams to get to the softer part of their schedule. I don't think there's any sort of, well, this team wants it more, Sam. That's why they'll win. But kind of a dynamic there that's worth noting, that the Vikings are super desperate in this game, and I don't know how they're feeling in Kansas City. Maybe they're mad at themselves for not winning good enough or something. What's the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we fight over who's writing about the quarterback almost every game. But this particular game, I am interested to see just how the quarterback responds to the worst we've seen him play, I think, since that AFC Championship game that he faltered in the second half against the Bengals. I hadn't seen a game like that from Patrick Mahomes, and I thought since then, which is, a year and a half ago. He's played 20-some games since then. And so I'm always really interested in the mental aspects of the game for the reasons we talked about earlier. I think we know what this quarterback can do. How does he play when things aren't going well? I think there's a reason he comes back in game so frequently, that he's got a better than 500 record when he falls behind double digits. He's pretty mentally resilient. But this was a full game that didn't look great. And he basically lost his fastball and decided, well, I'm going to throw the curveball and just use my legs to go win the game, which was how they milked the clock to the final drive to seal that win against the Jets. But he's bouncing back from, like I said, when I talked to the third string quarterback for a reason, which is I'm guessing that film session wasn't a lot of fun for him. But the history says that this guy plays his best coming off his very worst. And I think most teams you'd say, well, this guy's slumping. This is the time to get him. Most players, most teams. And I just think this guy can sometimes be the opposite. And so that's certainly, I think, the most intriguing part. Again, the quarterback's always the most intriguing part of this team, but I think there's extra reason for that to be the case Sunday.
Gosh, that's really something. I mean, that is really something. The guy has one mediocre game and still wins. I mean, Kirk did the same thing last week, didn't play well against Carolina, and we all kind of went like, okay, well, there's one. There's one that he didn't play well, and it's ironic that the Vikings are 1-3 and they won the one where he didn't play well and lost the ones where he did. I guess the QB wins people, at least for today, can have that one. But so I assume that you're expecting Kansas City to win. You must always expect Kansas City to win, right?
Yeah, I mean the tough part is always picking them against the spread every week more than actually picking the wins and losses. Even when you do the schedule before the season, you feel like, well, you can't pick them. They're not going to go 17-0, right? I think 14-3 is kind of the ceiling that any team in this day and age can probably go. And you're sort of picking like, where are the three losses in this schedule? They're favored in every game before the season started. Their closest line was actually one in New York. That was when Aaron Rodgers was supposed to play that game. That line winds up being 8.5. So yeah, I mean, it's tough on any individual basis, the cliche one game at a time, to think that the Chiefs are going to lose. I do think more so is what you said, Matt, is that I do think there's reason to believe it's going to be high scoring. I think there's reason to believe that, look, I mean, whether or not this Chiefs defense is real is so far been opponent driven. And this will be the best offense that they've seen since week one against the Lions. They haven't played. The Jaguars' offense is struggling. The Bears' offense is terrible. The Jets' offense is terrible. It'll be their first test in a month to see where their defense is at.
And the Jaguars were like a couple of toes away from a few more touchdowns in that game as well. All right, last thing for you, Sam. So you grew up in Kansas City, and that must have been around the 90s. It's kind of my era of growing up in football. You want to talk about some 90s Kansas City Chiefs? What a great history. I mean, the Montana, the Kimball Anders, the Marcus Allen, and then you get a second sort of run there with the Trent Green era. You said you were talking to the number 3 quarterback. That had to be Damon Heward, right? Maybe Brody Croyle mixed in. Who was your favorite growing up Kansas City Chiefs?
Those teams were just so different than what this team is. And I don't mean just in terms of success. I mean, those teams had the best defenses in football, and it was, can the offense get to 20? And so, I mean, you mentioned those players you mentioned, but like I remember watching a lot of Steve Bono games and a lot of Elvis Gerbach games, and they were just great in the regular season. Defense carried them. And they'd lose by missing field goals in the playoffs. So they'd lose by 3 or 4 points in the playoffs. But there was no player I thought was more exciting to watch than Derek Thomas. I mean, they were on the number one. He was on the number one defense, and I mean, it was cool to see Derek Thomas was back on the football news this week because Khalil Mack was 1 sack shy of tying his 7 sack in one game record. But man, the guy I've always thought that an edge rusher coming around the edge to get a quarterback is a pretty exciting NFL play because they move too well and bend too well for their size. And Derek Thomas, I think, was one of the origins of that.
I think Derek Thomas was kind of like our Lawrence Taylor, where somebody who, when he would sack the quarterback, it wasn't just that he got there and he took him down. It was it was a different look to it. Like you're saying, it wasn't. It's like Randy Moss didn't just catch passes; he caught them in a way. And the same thing for Derek Thomas getting sacks. I also love Neil Smith on the other side. So you had the nose thing on Neil Smith, and he was on one side, Derek Thomas on the other. Got James Hasty back there. I mean, those teams were really something. And I remember, like, one of my early memories was them beating Houston in the playoffs with Joe Montana. There was I think it was a Monday Night Football game, Montana versus Elway. Montana leads the game-winning drive. And still to this day, though, isn't it funny? They still don't have receivers. Like Tyreek Hill pops in, okay, here, there. But for the And even back then, they didn't have good wide receivers. They were constantly running that old pro set with the two backs, and then just throwing these little checkdowns and maybe completing an 8-yard pass. And they got DeBerg, Bono, Gerback, all to the playoffs just running that stuff. It was crazy.
Yeah, and then like you mentioned, I mean, when you get to the Trent Green era, they have the number one offense in the league. Which
Mhm.
I mean, their offensive line was as good as an offensive line there's probably been in football history. I mean, there's Hall of Famers galore on that offensive line, and so Priest Holmes is scoring 30 touchdowns in a season. Trent Green breaks a lot of franchise passing records, but even then, you're missing the number one wide receiver still. Tony Gonzalez is basically the number one wide receiver in those years. But I think a lot of people that probably grew up in that era would talk about Dante Hall being, one of their very favorite players to watch. One of the truly magnificent special teams players, I think, could be a local town's favorite player on a team. Dante Hall and Devin Hester are probably on a short list. But still, until this guy got here, everything was pretty consistent once it got to the playoffs, which were home or you earn home games. Sometimes you earn buys in the playoffs, but the victories don't come with it until number 15 gets here.
Will Shields and Willie Roaf combination. Oh my
And
God.
Brian Waters at guard, and then John Tate was a first round pick. I mean, their offensive line was, like I said, about as stout as NFL team has had.
Yeah, a really, really fun history for that team. So they're one I get excited about talking about. What they've gone through to get here at this point, and all the fun players along the way. So, Sam McDowell, this has been fantastic. People can follow you at Sam McDowell 11 on Twitter, and your pinned tweet, by the way, people should go check this out. You talked to people who intercepted Patrick Mahomes in high school for a story at the Super Bowl. One of my favorite stories of last year. So go to your Twitter page, check that out. And I will see you this weekend, man. Excited to have you up here. It's going to be great.
Yeah,
It'll be like 50 degrees.
yeah, I will say I am looking forward to it because I have heard like terrific things across. It's funny you talk to so many beat writers in this business, and there's a lot of good conversation about that stadium in Minnesota. And I mean, NFC opponent, so you consider you're probably only going to get up there every 8 years or so. So I am looking forward to just seeing the venue. I feel like as much as anything. Not that it won't be great to see you in person, but really the stadium. The stadium has to top the list, right?
All right, fair enough. They have ice cream at halftime and everything, so you'll have a good time. But I'm excited to have you up. We'll see you soon, and thanks for all the time, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely enjoyed it.